The small town of Greenwood, lost among the vast American forests, had always looked quiet and unremarkable. But its grim landmark was the old Willow Creek textile mill, which had stood in ruins for decades. Locals shunned the place, telling stories of ghosts, disappearances, and strange noises coming from inside. John Carter, a journalist for an independent online publication specializing in mysticism and urban legends, learned about the factory by chance when he came across a forum with eyewitness accounts. One user claimed to have seen human silhouettes in the factory's broken windows, although the building had long been empty. Another wrote that he heard screams that couldn't have belonged to humans. For John, it became the perfect subject for an article. He packed up his Gear A flashlight, a tape recorder, a camera, and a notebook and set out for Greenwood to solve the mystery of the factory. The factory stood on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense forest, like a grim monument to a bygone era. Its huge brick walls were overgrown with moss, and its tall chimneys stood black as charred fingers. John parked the car at the curb and walked to an old iron gate that overlooked a vacant lot littered with rusted metal and the remains of concrete structures. When he stepped inside, a chill ran through his body. The air was heavy with the smell of damp and something else, subtle but not unpleasant. John pulled out his camera and started filming. "This is it, the place that is the stuff of legend," he murmured into the microphone. "Tonight we're going to find out what the Willow Creek Factory is hiding." He walked through the first shop. Wreckage of old equipment lay strewn on the floor, and dust danced in the flashlight's rays. On one of the walls he noticed graffiti, "Stop! They're here." The red paint was smeared, as if the author had been in a hurry. John went deeper into the building. There was an ominous silence all around, broken only by the echo of his footsteps. Every now and then he stopped to jot down his thoughts or take a photograph. Suddenly he heard a knocking sound. It was a faint but distinct sound, as if someone had dropped a metal object. John froze. "Hey, is someone here?" he called out. There was no answer, but there was a faint rustle behind him, as if someone had run across the floor. John turned around sharply, but saw no one. "It was just a show," he reassured himself and went on. In one of the offices, where the floor was strewn with old papers and pieces of drywall, John found a filing cabinet. Opening it, he found several folders yellowed with age. One of them had "Accident 1964" written on the cover. Inside were photographs and reports. According to the documents, in 1964 there was an explosion of a steam boiler at the factory, which killed 23 workers. Among them were several children who, according to locals, were helping their parents. John felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. At that moment he thought there was someone standing behind him. Turning sharply, he saw nothing again. But the flashlight suddenly began to flicker. As John headed for the exit of the office, the door suddenly slammed shut. He tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. From down the hallway came the sound of children's voices, soft and long. "Who's there?" he shouted, but the voice echoed. In the flashlight's light, John saw movement. Something flickered at the far end of the corridor. Trying to suppress panic, he moved toward it. The shop he found himself in was huge, with high ceilings and rusty machinery. Suddenly, he heard a whisper behind him. When he looked back, he saw the figure of a child. It was a girl in a dirty dress. Her eyes seemed completely black. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. Then the light went out. There was laughter all around, and then shouting. John tried to run away, but his feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. Something invisible grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him backward. John came to in the woods near the factory. His belongings were scattered and his voice recorder was recording blankly. He struggled to get to his car, but everything that had happened seemed like a vague memory. Back home, he tried to listen to the recordings, but heard only one fragment where his own voice was heard saying, "They're here." The factory remained an unexplained place, and John never revisited the subject of mysticism again. If you need more details or refinements, let me know. John tried to forget about the night at the factory, but the strangeness began to haunt him. At home, he constantly felt someone's presence. The curtains moved on their own, Quiet footsteps were heard at night, and sometimes the TV would turn on, showing only static hissing. He thought he had lost his mind. Every time he tried to convince himself that it was a figment of his imagination, something new happened. One morning, John discovered notes on his notebook that he hadn't made. The crooked words, "Go away," and "We see you." Trying to make sense of what had happened led him back to the recordings from the factory. Listening to the audio files on the recorder, he discovered that in addition to his voice, he could hear the barely audible voices of children, whispers, and extended sounds like crying in the background. Determined not to give up, John began to gather information about the factory. In the local library, he found old newspapers that described the events of 1964. It turned out that the disaster had claimed not 23 lives, as the official documents said, but many more. The local authorities had concealed that the factory was conducting illegal experiments on children from the orphanage. One of the children, as it turned out, survived the explosion, but his mental state was disturbed. The boy's name was Edward, and in the last years of his life he claimed that something was left in the factory, that the spirits of the dead children were still trapped there. John contacted a relative of Edward's who still lived in Greenwood. The man said that Edward had always drawn the same thing: a tall black creature with long arms and a face like a rag mask. Realizing that the case remained unfinished, John decided to return to the factory to finish his investigation. This time he took with him not only the equipment, but also a friend, Tom, an old acquaintance with a fascination for the supernatural. When they arrived at the factory, the night was impenetrably dark. Lanterns illuminated only a small part of the road, and there were strange sounds coming from deep inside the building, as if someone was crying quietly. They stepped inside. Something was wrong from the start. The air felt cold, like a frosty day, even though it was a mild fall night outside. Suddenly Tom stopped and whispered, "Do you hear that?" John strained his hearing. Barely audible voices came from the darkness. They moved farther and farther away until they were in the same workshop where John had seen the girl. In the center of the workshop, they found a circle made of stones. There were symbols carved into the floor that Tom identified as something that looked like protective markings. It was done to seal something inside, Tom said, but someone had clearly broken the circle. At that moment, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the same girl, but now her face was disfigured and her eyes glowed with a pale light. She raised her hand and pointed at John. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice echoing through the shop. Behind her, a creature emerged from the shadows, a tall black silhouette with a mask instead of a face. It moved slowly, but every movement was eerily unnatural. Tom tried to light a candle and cast some kind of spell, but the creature lunged at him. John screamed, grabbed the camera and ran for the exit. John managed to get out, but Tom remained in the factory. The police who arrived on the scene after his call found no body or trace of his friend. The factory was permanently closed and declared dangerous to visit. But John knew it wasn't over. Every time he looked at the tapes from that night, he noticed a black silhouette in the background. He didn't try to write about it anymore and moved to another city. But sometimes, in the silence of the night, he can still hear the children's laughter. If you like the story, you can add more details or develop character lines. After moving in, John hoped he had left the factory and its horrors behind him. However, strange things began to happen in his new apartment. At night, he heard creaks and footsteps in the hallway, even though he lived alone. Sometimes his things were out of place. One day he woke up to a loud noise. Jumping out of bed, John saw that all the cabinets in the kitchen were open, and on the wall were words scratched out with something sharp. "You can't hide." John began to suspect that the factory was connected to him on a deeper level. He began to study ancient rituals and rites of exorcism, hoping to break the connection. During one of his investigations, he came across an old article that mentioned the name of Thomas Wilson, the founder of the Willow Creek Factory. It turned out that Wilson was obsessed with the idea of immortality. He secretly performed rituals using children from a local orphanage as victims. These rituals were supposed to open a portal to the other world, to make a deal with an ancient spirit. But something went wrong, and instead of the promised immortality, the spirit destroyed everyone in the factory. Since then, the building became a receptacle for lost souls, and Wilson himself remained there in the form of the same black creature. John began to look for specialists who could help him get rid of the curse. Through the internet, he found a woman named Sarah, an occultist and medium who claimed she could help him close the portal. "You've attracted the attention of something ancient," she said, studying John's tape recorder. "It won't let you go until you go back and finish what you started." Sarah suggested a trip back to the factory to perform the closing ritual. John, despite his fear, agreed. When they arrived at the factory, the night was even darker than last time. Sarah immediately sensed the presence of something sinister. She pulled candles, amulets, and a book of ancient spells from her bag. "We must find the center of the energy," she said. "That's where Wilson's ritual began." John led her to the very workshop where he had first seen the girl. As they entered, the air felt heavy and the walls seemed to move. Out of the darkness came the children's voices again, growing louder by the second. Sarah stood in the center of the room and began to recite spells. Suddenly, shadows began to emerge from the corners of the room, figures of children with empty eyes and mutilated bodies. "They're trying to stop us. Keep them away until I'm done," Sarah shouted. John grabbed a flashlight and started blinding the approaching shadows. This held them off, but not for long. As Sarah spoke the last words, the floor beneath their feet shook. From the center of the hall rose a black creature that resembled the same Wilson. It was huge, its face a rag mask, and black liquid flowing from its eyes. Sarah threw the amulet at it, casting a final spell. The creature roared so loudly that John's ears popped. A flash of light illuminated the workshop and the shadows began to fade. When everything went quiet, John and Sarah found themselves on the floor. The factory was beginning to crumble, as if it was being eaten away from the inside. "We have to get out," Sarah screamed. They ran outside as the building collapsed. All that was left in its place was a pile of bricks and ashes. John finally felt the curse disappear. The shadows no longer followed him, and his house was calm again. Sarah had warned him, "Some doors are best left unlocked. You've seen what happens when a man plays with forces he doesn't understand." Willow Creek Factory had become a legend, vanished from the real world, but forever in John's memory. Now he no longer looked for mysticism, but every time he walked past the abandoned buildings, a chill ran down his spine. He knew that evil may sleep, but it never dies. Several months had passed since the destruction of the Willow Creek Factory. John was relieved. His dreams had become peaceful. There were no more strange things happening in the house, and life seemed to be returning to normal. He even started writing a new book, this time a novel, completely fictional, without a hint of mysticism. But the calm was deceptive. John came home late one night. The light bulbs in his apartment began to flicker, even though he had recently replaced all the bulbs. Then a familiar whispering sounded. He struggled to suppress panic and figured it was just fatigue. But when he turned on his laptop to distract himself, an image of a factory appeared on the screen instead of his desktop. A black and white, like a faded photo, with children's silhouettes in the windows. "Impossible," he whispered, turning off the laptop. But the next night, the phenomena repeated itself. And again, John decided to contact Sarah. She agreed to meet, but sounded concerned on the phone. "Are you sure you destroyed everything you took from the factory?" she asked. "Yes, I didn't take anything," John replied. She hesitated and suggested that they discuss it in person again. Soon John arrived at her house, bringing only the records and photographs from before the factory's destruction. Sarah scrutinized the materials until her face darkened. "There's something wrong here," she said, pointing to one of the photographs. It was the moment of their ritual, and in Sarah's hand she could see the very amulet she had sealed Wilson with. "That amulet, it disappeared after the ritual," she continued. "If it still exists, the spirit could have used it as an anchor to keep it connected to this world." John shook his head. "But we didn't take anything with us. Everything stayed there in the factory." Sarah frowned. "Not everything," If the factory is destroyed and the spirit is still manifesting, then its connection isn't the place. It's you. John couldn't believe it, but Sarah was sure. Destroying the factory hadn't severed the connection with the spirit. Instead, it had attached itself to John himself, using him as a conduit between worlds. You became part of the ritual when you entered that circle, she said. You must break that bond or it will never end. She offered to perform a cleansing ritual, but it required rare ingredients and, most importantly, an object that bound the spirit to John. Find something that came into your life after the factory. It can be anything. A thing, a symbol, even an idea that continues to draw energy to you, she explained. John returned home and began to scrutinize everything in his apartment. He went through every shelf, every box, but found nothing suspicious. But when he turned on the tape recorder to listen to the recordings from the factory again, something strange happened. Instead of the usual rustles and sounds, there was a clear voice on the tape. You belong to us. The voice sounded simultaneously like a man's, a woman's, and a child's, as if it was a blending of many tones. John realized that his own recorder had become the anchor. It was he who had recorded something in the factory, and that something was now following him. Sarah prepared a purification ritual. It required destroying the recorder, but not just smashing it. She explained that the ritual had to be done in a place where the spirit energy was particularly strong. We'll go back to the ruins of the factory, she said. It's the only place to break the connection. John didn't want to go back, but he had no choice. When they arrived at the site, the factory no longer resembled itself. In its place were only charred rocks and rubble. But the air was still saturated with something sinister. Sarah set up a circle of salt and lit candles. John placed the recorder in the center of the circle. It could be dangerous, she warned. The spirit will try to stop us. As the ritual began, the wind picked up around them. The same figures began to emerge from the shadows, children with empty eyes. They surrounded the circle, whispering the same word, "Stay." Sarah continued to recite the incantations despite the pressure. John felt his mind begin to cloud over, as if someone was trying to penetrate his thoughts. Suddenly, the very same silhouette appeared out of the darkness. The creature with the rag mask held out a hand to John. "Come back! You're one of us," it hissed. John gathered all his strength and screamed, "No!" Sarah spoke the last words of the spell and the recorder flashed with a bright light. The creature howled and disappeared, along with the shadows. When all was quiet, John felt incredibly relieved. For the first time in a long time, he was free. Sarah smiled and said, "Now you are truly free." They returned home, knowing that evil had finally been defeated. But somewhere deep in the forest, among the ruins of the factory, the cold wind still carried echoes of children's laughter. Those who came after. It had been 5 years since the destruction of the Willow Creek Factory. The town of Greenwood was trying to forget about its sinister history. People avoided the site where the factory once stood, and officials even discussed building a park there to finally erase the grim past. But the area where the factory once stood remained cursed. Those who dared to come closer reported strange sounds and the feeling that someone was watching them. A group of young enthusiasts from a neighboring town decided to explore the abandoned site. The team of 4 was led by Mark, a video blogger with a passion for the paranormal. He was joined by his girlfriend Laura, camera technician Nick, and their friend Alex, a skeptic who joined more for the company than for his belief in the supernatural. Mark heard about the factory from an old article on the internet and decided it was the perfect subject for a new video. Ignoring the warnings of the locals, he persuaded his team to go to the site of the former factory. "It's just a ruin," he assured the others. "But if we can capture anything weird, it'll be a hit." They reached the site at night. All that remained of the factory was a pile of charred stones and metal frames half buried underground. Laura sensed something wrong at once. "It's too quiet," she whispered. "You can't even hear the birds." But Mark only grinned. "It's great for the atmosphere." They started setting up cameras and equipment. Nick set up the motion sensors and thermal imaging cameras. Alex checked the microphones, and Laura looked around with a flashlight. An hour after they started filming, strange things started happening. One of the thermal imaging cameras detected movement in the center of the area, although there were no living creatures around. It could be an animal, Alex suggested, but when they approached the place where the movement had been detected, there was nothing there. Only deep coldness, as if the temperature had dropped sharply. "That's not normal," Nick said, pointing at the screen. "The temperature here is 10 degrees lower than the rest of the field." Laura felt someone tugging at her jacket. She turned around sharply, but there was no one behind her. "There's something here," she whispered. When they returned to their base near the car, Alex suddenly discovered that one of the voice recorders was missing. "I definitely left it here," he insisted. Mark decided to go back to check the place where they had been earlier. Laura and Nick went with him, while Alex stayed by the car to check the recorders. When they got to the location where the cold patch had been recorded, they found the recorder, but it looked strange. The buttons were broken and there were scratches on the case, as if someone had tried to carve the words. Laura picked up the recorder and turned it on. Only noises could be heard on the recording, but at one point a voice came through. "Why are you here?" When the three returned to the car, Alex wasn't there. His phone and belongings were still there, but he was gone. They started calling for him, but there was no answer. Nick turned on the thermal imager and noticed that there was a faint trace of heat coming from the woods nearby. "He could have gone that way," Mark said. They headed into the woods. With each step, the darkness grew thicker and the air heavier. After walking for a few minutes, they heard a rustling sound. Mark shined his flashlight and the silhouette of a child appeared in the beam of light. It was a little girl with empty eyes and soiled clothes. "Can you see it?" Laura whispered, stepping back. The girl looked straight at them, and then slowly raised her hand, pointing deeper into the forest. "It's a trap," Nick said, but Mark went ahead. Soon they came to a clearing where they found Alex. He was standing in the middle of a circle made of stones and looked completely motionless. "Alex!" Laura shouted, but he didn't respond. When they tried to get closer, the girl appeared again, now inside the circle. "Go away," she whispered. It is unknown what happened that night, but Laura, Nick and Mark left the forest without Alex. They reported him missing to the police, but he was never found. Mark stopped blogging and Laura began suffering from nightmares. Nick moved to another state and never spoke of that night again. But every year, on the day Alex disappeared, Mark receives a letter from an unfamiliar address. Inside is just a picture of a factory and a caption. "You woke us up." It had been 2 years since Alex had disappeared. Laura, Mark, and Nick had moved away and were no longer in touch. Nick refused to communicate with anyone from the group, and Mark completely deleted all his videos about the factory. But one day, Laura received a strange message. It was an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line was, "He's alive." Inside was a photo obviously taken recently. It was of Alex. He was standing in the middle of a dark forest, and his face expressed utter despair. Underneath the photo was only one phrase, "Come back. He's here and he's waiting." Laura immediately contacted Mark, even though it had been over a year since they'd last seen each other. He refused to discuss the factory at first, but when she showed him the photo, he fell silent. "It's impossible," he said. "It's gone. We've seen everything." Laura insisted that they had to go back to find out the truth. Mark resisted, but eventually agreed. They also decided to find Nick. When they arrived at his house, Nick wouldn't let them in at first. But as soon as Laura showed him the photo, he turned pale and, with trembling hands, opened the door. "I never wanted to go back," he said, looking at the picture. "But if Alex is there, we have to do something." That same night, the three went to the ruins of the factory again. Now the place looked even more ominous. Vegetation densely surrounded the area, as if the forest was trying to hide it from the world. Setting up cameras and flashlights, they began their search. Laura kept feeling that someone was watching them. "Do you hear that?" she whispered as a faint whisper sounded in the distance. They followed the sound, which led them to an old concrete foundation left over from the building. On one section of the ground, They found a hole in the concrete pavement, an entrance to an underground tunnel they had not known existed before. The air from inside was damp and heavy. "This place creeps me out," Nick said, peering into the dark hole. Mark put on his headlamp and went inside first. Laura and Nick followed him. The tunnel was narrow and went deep underground. The walls were covered with strange symbols carved into the stone. Laura noticed that some of them resembled the ones she had seen on the recorder that night. When they reached the end of the tunnel, they saw something incredible. Alex was standing in the center of a huge underground hall. He looked aged, his clothes were worn out, and his eyes were full of emptiness. "Alex!" Laura shouted, running up to him, but he didn't react. He slowly turned his head toward her, and then said quietly, "You shouldn't have come back." As soon as Alex said those words, the air in the hall became cold and the walls began to shake. Shadows appeared around them, the same empty-eyed children they had seen before. "They won't let us go," Alex said. His voice sounded strange, as if he spoke not alone but in unison with other voices. Mark tried to move closer, but suddenly one of the shadows jumped forward and grabbed his arm. He screamed in pain, and his skin began to be covered in dark spots. "Run!" Laura shouted, grabbing Nick's arm. But Alex took a step forward and stopped them. His face began to change, transforming into something inhuman. "You woke us up. Now you're ours." Laura and Nick struggled to get out of the tunnel, leaving Alex and Mark inside. When they got outside, the ground began to shake and the tunnel collapsed, burying everything inside. But when they reached the car, Laura noticed a fresh scratch on the rearview mirror. It was the word, "We'll be back." Since then, Laura and Nick have lived with constant fear. Every night they hear whispers outside their windows and see shadows sliding across the walls. Their lives have become a nightmare from which there is no escape. They know it's not over. The evil they have awakened is just waiting to happen. Laura and Nick tried to live a normal life, but the past wouldn't let them go. First there were whispers at night, then disappearing shadows in the corners of their rooms. Laura tried to find help, psychologists, experts in the paranormal, but no one could provide answers, and the nightmares became more and more real. One day Laura found an old photograph on her door. It was a snapshot of the group from that night at the factory. On the back in red marker it said, "You forgot it." Laura decided to seek help from a man she had previously avoided. Andrew Hunter, a local researcher of the paranormal, was known for his controversial methods, but he had a reputation for facing real evil. When she showed him the picture and told him everything that had happened, he listened intently and said, "These are not just spirits. This is something ancient. Those who came before us left these places for a reason. If they have returned to you, then you are still connected to them." Andrew suggested going back to the factory ruins, but this time with the goal of finding what keeps evil in this world. "If you want to end this, you're going to have to face fear again," he said. Nick at first refused to participate in the new quest. He was trying to forget everything and felt that any interference would only make things worse. But when Laura told him about the pictures and the constant whispers, he realized that the problems wouldn't go away on their own. "We have to finish what we started," she said. Eventually Nick agreed, and the three of them headed back to Greenwood. When they reached the ruins, Andrew pulled out some strange devices, metal frames for detecting energy fields, ancient maps with symbols, and an amulet that he claimed was a protection against evil spirits. "This factory was built on a site that was originally considered cursed," he explained. "Rituals were performed here long before the factory came into existence. Perhaps the spirits you've encountered are just a manifestation of something more." Andrew began to survey the area, with Laura and Nick following him. They found the remains of the tunnel that had collapsed that day. "This is where we'll start," Andrew said as he pulled out a shovel. As they began to dig through the rubble, it became unusually quiet. Andrew suddenly stopped and listened. "They're here," he said. Figures began to emerge from the darkness. Laura recognized the same children, but they looked different now. Their faces were distorted and their bodies were covered with dark spots. One of the figures came closer and reached out to Andrew. He immediately activated his amulet, and the figure backed away, making a long whispering sound. "They're protecting something," he said. "We have to get to the bottom of this or we're all going to die." As they dug through some of the rubble, they found a large stone with symbols carved into it. Andrew scrutinized them and turned pale. "It's a seal," he explained. "This place holds something much more powerful than we thought." But when he tried to photograph the symbols, the stone began to tremble and the ground beneath his feet cracked. From beneath the stone came an ominous voice. "You have come too far." Andrew began to recite incantations in an ancient language, trying to close the rift, but the figures began to attack them. Nick and Laura tried to fight back using the candles and salt Andrew had brought, but the creatures grew more and more aggressive. Laura felt a cold wind envelop her body and suddenly saw Alex in front of her. "You have to leave," he said. "They want you." But Laura couldn't leave Andrew and Nick. She gathered all her courage and walked over to the rock, placing her hand on it. "What do I have to do?" she asked. A voice from the rift answered, "Accept us or sacrifice yourself." Laura knew there was no choice. If she didn't stop it now, the evil would spread further. She looked at Nick and said, "Go away. Tell everyone that this place must be destroyed." Before anyone could stop her, Laura spoke the words she heard in the voices. "I accept you." Light engulfed her body and the rift closed. The ground stopped shaking and the figures disappeared. But Laura was gone. Nick and Andrew returned to the city. Nick told the authorities what was happening, and a few months later the factory area was completely filled with concrete and declared a closed zone. But in the last few nights, Nick heard the whispers again. And one morning he found a photograph on his doorstep. It was of Laura standing among the shadows. And the caption, "We're back."